Welcome to Exhumed, an underground retrospective of arts and culture in the late 20th century. I'm James Wallace. In tonight's episode, we are going to look at three of the most experimental post-punk bands: Swell Maps, The Pop Group, and This Heat. In today's episode, we are going to look at three post-punk bands that pushed the levels of experimentation in their music: Swell Maps, The Pop Group, and This Heat. All three of these bands created unique artistic visions in a relatively short period of time and would have a huge impact on the underground music scenes of the 80s and 90s. Swell Maps trace their roots back to Solihull, West Midlands, in the early 70s. The members of the band had been jamming together since around 1972 and were interested in a variety of music from that time, ranging from glam rock like T-Rex and David Bowie to straight-ahead rock like Dr. Feelgood, experimental prog such as Gong and Van de Graaff Generator, and krautrock like Kahn or Faust. This simultaneous love of both three-chord rock and wild experimentation would be the essence of the Swell Maps sound. The members soon were caught up in the punk explosion. Eventually, the lineup consisted of the brothers Kevin Paul Godfrey, now known as Epic Soundtracks, and Adrian Nicholas Godfrey, now known as Nicky Sutton, Stephen Bird, who took on the name Jowhead, Richard Scodwell, now known as Biggles Books, David Barrington, now known as Phone Sportsman, and John Golden Cockrell. After hearing bands like The Desperate Bicycles and The Buzzcocks, they were convinced that they could record their own record. They came up with the name Swell Maps and pooled their money and went to the Spaceward Sound Studios to record 7 songs. One of those songs was their debut single, Read About Seymour, which they distributed themselves. The track is only 90 seconds and is a punk rock romp that sounds like it was recorded on cheap recording equipment in an abandoned garage. The song is a straightforward 3-chord song with multiple vocalists chanting the chorus before eventually descending into chaos and experimentation. It was this tension that summed up the sound of the band. While Nicky Sutton wanted to play straight-ahead rock and roll, the rest of the band wanted madness and experimentation. Their DIY approach to recording gave them a particular lo-fi sound. They did have a champion in radio DJ John Peel. They would end up recording their first Peel session in 1978. The band would eventually sign to the newly formed Rough Trade Records and would end up going to the Woodbine Mobile Recording Studio in Royal Leamington Spa, Warwickshire, England, in late 1978 and early 1979 to record most of the tracks on their debut album, A Trip to Marineville. The album included tracks that had been recorded in 1977 as well. This album is chaotic and full of humor, noise, musique concrète, and straight-ahead rock and roll. HS Art, the first track, starts out with snotty lo-fi punk a la the Buzzcocks, but soon chaotic freeform piano becomes part of the track. Numerous songs on the album are less than 2 minutes and are played in that same punchy punk rock style. Longer tracks like Harmony in Your Bathroom have samples of Bubbles in the mix. Tracks like Don't Throw Your Ashtray at Me is just piano playing fused with strange sounds and dialogue. Midget Submarine is a complete post-punk dirge, while Bridgehead Part 9 is pure noise and musique concrete. The song Lion of the Surf has ferocious surf guitar rhythms. While the album did not sell particularly well at the time of its release, it would help give the birth to the lo-fi underground of the 80s and 90s. One can hear the influence that the band would have on both Sonic Youth and Pavement on this album. Instrumentation included a vacuum cleaner, as played by Head on the track Midget Submarines. The band would release the both hypnotic and raucous lo-fi single, Let's Build a Car, and would do 2 more sessions for John Peel before heading into the studio to record their second and final album, Jane from Occupied Europe. Noisy experimental electronics open up the album on the track Robot Factory, before going into their usual lo-fi melodic dirge on Border Country. Helicopter Skies is a direct precursor to Sonic Youth. Certain other tracks are pure avant-garde noise, such as Big Ma's in the Desert. Others, like Big Empty Field, sounds like industrial krautrock. Another highlight is the instrumental track Collision with a Frogman versus the Mangrove Dental Plan, which is a pure post-punk dirge. The listener gets the noisy pop on Secret Island. The album is more focused than their debut, and it expands the experimentation, but still retains its disjointedness. To say that Swell Maps' music was ahead of their time is a serious understatement. One could play Trip to Marineville or Jane from Occupied Europe to a new listener and state that it was recorded in the 90s, and such a statement could be accepted as fact. Swell Maps unfortunately broke up after the second album's release. Since they had actually recorded so much material, posthumous compilations appeared over the years. Whatever Happened Next and Collision Time in 1981, Train Out of It in 1986, Collision Time Revisited in 1989, International Rescue in 1999, Sweep the Desert in 2000, Wastrels and Whippersnappers in 2006, and Mayday Signals in 2021. The members went on to play in various groups and solo projects. Nicky Sudden had a solo career and collaborated with Dave Cusworth in the Jacobites. Epic Soundtracks would have a solo career and play in Crime in the City Solution. Jowhead was a member of Television Personalities, and Biggles Books released a solo album in 1981 under the name Richard Earl. Epic Soundtracks died in 1997, and Sudden passed away from a heart attack in 2006, leaving Jowhead to be the curator for the band's legacy. As stated earlier, Swell Maps had a huge impact on indie music in the 80s, 90s, and the millennium. Sonic Youth's Thurston Moore stated that Swell Maps had a lot to do with my upbringing, and Pavement's Scott Canberg said Swell Maps was a big influence on our early records. Swell Maps are a pivotal band in the development of lo-fi and indie rock. When the birthday party arrived in England in 1980, as Nick Cave said, he was hoping the city would be filled with bands like The Fall and The Pop Group. But they found the new wave bands in the city to be culturally vapid and were nothing like The Fall or The Pop Group. And The Pop Group was anything but boring. In fact, the band's namesake is a complete misnomer. The Pop Group is anything but a conventional pop group. The band created this unique amalgamation of punk, funk, free jazz, dub, and avant-garde noise that would have a huge impact on underground music in decades to come. The roots of the band go back to Bristol in 1977. Mark Stewart started a funk group with friends John Waddington and Simon Underwood during the height of the punk explosion. Mark Stewart was the vocalist with Simon Underwood on bass, John Waddington on guitar. Soon the band was joined by guitarist Gareth Sager, who also played saxophone and piano, along with drummer Bruce Smith. Even though they were inspired by punk and its DIY ethic, they found three-chord punk too conventional. The band was inspired by the funk of James Brown and Funkadelic. Free jazz musicians like Ornette Coleman, Albert Ayler, and Pharoah Sanders. Musical mavericks like Captain Beefheart and Sun Ra. Miles Davis's Electric Period. Dub Gray artists like King Tubby. Krautrock like Noi. New York punks like New York Dolls and Television. French singer Jacques Brel, and a variety of composers including Claude Debussy, John Cage, and Steve Reich. But the band also took inspiration from literature, philosophy, and politics. Members of the band were huge fans of Comte de Lautremont, Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean Baudrillard, beat poetry, and, like the band Gang of Four, the Situationists. What the five musicians created was a unique stew, where the rhythms were funky and even danceable, but the lead vocalist was screaming in agony, and all kinds of avant-garde noises would fill in the spaces. The group's live shows earned them a fierce reputation. They landed a record deal with Radar Records and released their debut single, She Is Beyond Good and Evil. This single was a direct homage to Nietzsche's famous work and combined their influences of funky rhythm, dub reggae recording, freeform noise, and screaming vocals. 1 month later, the band released Why, their debut album. This album highlighted the band's love of dissonance, noise, atonality, and cacophony. Highlights included the vicious funk of Thief of Fire, Words Disobey Me, and Don't Call Me Pain. Other slower tracks like Snow Girl and Savage Sea contain Stewart's somber vocals over experimental piano playing and other strange sounds. While this album did not sell very well, it was praised by some critics and would have an impact on many artists. Nick Cave described watching a pop group performance. It's one of those moments we feel just change the cogs of your mind and they shift, and your life is going to be irreversibly changed forever. David J. of Bauhaus described the pop group as one of the few bands in the post-punk scene that Bauhaus could relate to. The band would go on to release the single We Are All Prostitutes, which kept that ugly dissonant funk tradition. The cover shows newly elected British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher giving the V or up yours sign. The band would become disillusioned and paranoid as Margaret Thatcher came to power, and in turn would adopt a sort of agit-prop style to their music. The result was the 1980 album Why Do We Tolerate Mass Murder? Bassist Simon Underwood had been replaced by Dan Katzis, who was able to hold up the bass end of the band's sound, and he starts out the song ripping on his bass on the song Forces of Oppression. The chaotic Feed the Hungry has free jazz, saxophone, while Stewart rants about exploitation in various parts of the world. The band goes full-on dub reggae on There Are No Spectators, and the band sounds like a psychotic ska band on Rob a Bank. The album's lyrics really highlighted the overt anti-capitalist stance of the band. However, things would soon fall apart. After releasing the split single with the Slits, Where There's a Will, the combination of the rise of Thatcher's government, along with arguments between members and legal troubles that the band was having, caused them to split up in 1981. The members would go on to pursue various musical projects. Mark Stewart would make a lot of dub-style music under his own name as Mark Stewart and the Mafia, and also recorded with the New Age Steppers and Tackhead. Waddington worked with Maximum Joy. Sager was a member of Rip, Rag, and Panic. Underwood joined Pigbag. Smith played drums with Pill, African Head Charge, Rip, Rag, and Panic, and The, while Katzis played with the band The Blue Aeroplanes. Eventually, Stewart, Sager, Katzis, and Smith would start playing together again in 2010, and eventually released 2 albums of new material, 2015's Citizen Zombie and 2016's Honeymoon on Mars. A few compilations, unreleased tracks, and live recordings have also been released. Even though they did not sell well during the time they originally were together, the pop group have influenced a lot of artists, including The Minutemen, Primal Scream, Sonic Youth, Massive Attack, Steve Albini, and Trent Reznor. Nick Cave's vocals in The Birthday Party and David Yow's singing in Scratch Acid and the Jesus Lizard take direct inspiration from Mark Stewart's own screams. The pop group's frantic and chaotic sound was quite unlike anything that came before them, and introduced an embracing of noise that would impact underground bands in decades to come after their initial breakup. The last band featured in tonight's episode is probably the most experimental of the 3, This Heat. In fact, some people might argue that they are outside of the post-punk scene due to the band's roots. But this experimental trio would release 2 albums that would impact the evolution of rock, as their sound foreshadowed what would happen in industrial music, noise rock, and post-rock in the decades to come. In late 1975, Charles Bullen, Charles Hayward, and Gareth Williams started playing together. Bullen and Hayward had played together in Quiet Sun, a prog fusion project of Roxy Music guitarist Phil Manzara, and the band recorded the one-off self-titled album in 1975. Bullen and Hayward bonded over their love of experimental music. They were soon joined by the artist Gareth Williams, who was not a musician but had a keen sense of musical textures. The trio named themselves This Heat after the 1976 British heatwave. They sent a demo in 1977 to John Peel, who played it on his show. Their debut album was recorded between 1976 and 1978 and would eventually be released in 1979. Each of the musicians played multiple instruments and also tape loops. The result was an album filled with electronic noise, soundscapes that were inspired by modern composers like John Cage and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, abrasive guitar, driving percussion, and just an overall starkness. The sound was the missing link between the experimental prog of bands like Henry Cow and those of the post-punk and early industrial bands. A highlight track is Horizontal Hold, which features scraping and strangely tuned guitar sounds with odd sound loops and driving drums. This album is hard to categorize musically. The band would follow up with the Health and Efficiency EP in 1980, which had slightly more conventional song structures amidst the chaos. But there's nothing conventional about the music of This Heat. Then the band would release their final album, which many consider to be their masterpiece, Deceit, in 1981. They continued on the trajectory of incorporating more of a rock sound, but they also included elements of world music. The album starts out with the eerie Sleep, which has chanting, almost melodic vocals over tribal percussion. Paper Hat starts out with an almost uneasy math rock rhythm, followed by moaning, then screaming vocals. SPQR has melody, droning repetitive guitars, and just a tone of uneasiness. It is actually very difficult to describe This Heat's music in words. Rock, jazz, world music, musique concrète are all stewed together like a post-apocalyptic krautrock. The album apparently was recorded in an abandoned meat locker, which explains the sparseness of the sound. The band would break up in 1982. Their albums sold poorly, but are now considered to be post-punk classics. The band's sound foreshadowed the post-apocalyptic tribal sounds of Savage Republic and the dissonant guitar symphonies of Glenn Branca. The band influenced bands such as Sonic Youth, Pill, Swans, Stereolab, Six Finger Satellite, Radiohead, and post-rock bands like Tortoise. Unfortunately, Williams died of cancer in 2001, just as the three members started to rehearse together. Bullen and Hayward have performed together under the name This Is Not This Heat. Swell Maps, the pop group, and This Heat show the range of experimentation that occurred during the post-punk era. I highly recommend that listeners check out all three bands. Now turn into the next episode, where we're going to look at the very high involvement of female musicians in the post-punk scene. Take care. I'm James Wallace.